Got it.
Welcome.
Let's wait for a bit, please. Let's wait. Thank you. Yes, we can start now. My colleague Ashutosh will be making the technical announcement. But before that, I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar on the crisis in Sri Lanka. We are very happy to see so many people have registered, and we are very happy to know that many people from Southeast Asia have also joined. So we look forward to understanding more about the situation, as well as learning from our affiliates on what kind of solidarity actions we can even take going forward. I'm especially thankful to our Vice President, Akira Takakura, who has agreed to make opening remarks here. Of course, our leadership at La Jolla and Kemal Oskan, despite it being really early in Geneva right now. We have a guest speaker, Ahilan Kadirgamar, and we look forward to hearing from him, as well as two of our affiliates from Sri Lanka who will actually be speaking, Anton Marcus and Swastika Arulingam. So thank you, everybody, for joining today. And Ashutosh, just make the technical announcement, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Apurva. The various interpretation channels are available. If you want to listen the discussion in Japanese, please select the right channel. Only for the Thai interpreters, Thai participants, please select Spanish channel. I think you all might be aware now with Zoom. For those who join through laptop, there is interpretation option, globe button. From there, you can select the channel. Those who join from the mobile, please select the plus 3 dots button. From there, you can select. There are a lot of participants, so we request you to mute yourself. If you want to intervene or if you want to raise any point, please raise your hand. And there is one sexual harassment policy industry all has. If you witness any such kind of behavior, please inform Apurva or Shinya immediately. Thank you so much. Over back to Apurva. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashutosh. And we don't have too much time. We just have 2 hours for this meeting. So I would request Takakura-san to give us his opening remarks. Takakura-san.
Hi.
Hi. Yes, thank you for your kind introduction, Apurva, and hello to all of you. It's good to see all of you. And today we will be talking about the crisis in Sri Lanka in this webinar, and I am so happy and glad that all of you have gathered here today. We are witnessing energy crisis and rapid increase in inflation in every country around the world. On the other hand, wages are not increasing, giving serious impact on workers' daily lives, especially in Sri Lanka. Well, the country has defaulted and it is suffering from an economic crisis caused by enormous amount of external debt and shortage of foreign currency. It is also facing political crisis, including resignation of the president. The crisis has left many workers in a difficult situation. At the Asia-Pacific Regional Executive Committee meeting held last month, Sister Arulingam gave a report on the situation in Sri Lanka. Increase in food prices in Sri Lanka is now over 90%, astonishing figure, putting pressure on people's livelihoods. Unions are demanding for increase in minimum wages, but government is not responding to this demand. And moreover, employers are taking advantage of this current crisis, attempting to weaken workers' rights. We cannot allow such downgrading of workers' rights. Industrial affiliates in Sri Lanka are working hard to protect the rights and help the daily lives of the union members. On behalf of all members in Industrial Asia-Pacific region, I sincerely salute the hard struggle of our colleagues in Sri Lanka affiliates and express solidarity. Today, we hope to learn more about the current situation in Sri Lanka and discuss how to respond from now onwards. And through this webinar, let us further strengthen solidarity of Industrial and all the affiliates with our brothers and sisters in Sri Lanka. I look forward to an active discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Takakura-san, for your opening remarks. We have a lot of messages on chat saying they cannot hear. The audio, as far as I know, is very, very clear. So please make sure that you are connected to your audio. If it is difficult for you to hear, please, I would suggest that you need to choose the computer audio. Yap has sent that message on the chat again. Use the audio. You'll have to connect to audio also and make sure you choose the correct language. The audio is very clear, and I think we've tested the interpretation. It is working. So thank you very much, but please connect to audio of your computers. Thank you. Please check your audio connections. Thank you very much. I would like to now invite our General Secretary, Atle Hoya, to give us his opening remarks, please. Atle, you're still muted.
Can you hear me now? That's better. Thank you. Thank you, Apurva. Thanks, Takakura-san. I can only repeat what Takakura said. Sri Lanka has been through a lot. You're supposed to celebrate your 75th independence anniversary soon, and you're in one of the worst crises the country has ever seen. It will be interesting to hear during this seminar how we can continue the support and solidarity that we have as industrial affiliates, both in the region, but also globally, towards Sri Lanka. I know that the American foreign minister visited Sri Lanka recently. I know they discussed human rights and trade union rights, but I don't know if anything substantial came out of this. But obviously, in a transformation back to a proper democracy in Sri Lanka, trade union rights and human rights are of utmost importance. I look really forward to listening in. That's why I'm here, because I need to learn more about Sri Lanka and about the situation, to be able to assess together with my colleagues in the regional offices and in Geneva, how we can be of support, solidarity and assistance to our affiliates in Sri Lanka. So thank you very much for arranging this seminar.
Thank you, dear Atle. Can we ask Kemal, Comrade Kemal, to give his opening remarks, please?
Good morning, Apurva, my dear sisters, brothers, comrades, dear Vice President Takakura. Indeed, it is still dark here in Geneva in our office, But today is very important. Sri Lanka has turned to be the laboratory of the failure of the global economic and social system. And I have just returned back from Africa, and the inequality is really booming everywhere. This is not bearable. And let me reflect the very recent the report from the International Labour Organization. And since 2008 crisis, I can tell you, my dear sisters, brothers, comrades, and the real wages really dropped everywhere in the world. And if we remove China, it is 1.4%. We know that in many countries in global south, the situation is much more worse. And despite the rises to keep up inflation, the minimum wage fell in real terms in many countries, including Sri Lanka. And I can tell you that at the moment, the world is witnessing a real biggest gap between labor productivity and the wage growth in the whole world. This is not bearable. And this is also coinciding with a time when we still have quite low level employment. And there is a huge deterioration in the quality of employment. And particularly in coming out from the crisis of COVID, I can tell you that there are jobs, but those jobs are just produced in the informal economy. So we are losing huge employment. We are losing also the quality of employment. So when we combine all these, then it brings us a huge inequality, the crisis as we are living right now in Sri Lanka. But we need to keep our fight, and then we need to demand the real policy lines, and we need policies for supporting the full employment, fair wages, decent work, and social protection. And for sure, we need an investment in the jobs, in the public services. And particularly, I can tell you, everywhere in Global South, particularly, we have a huge problem of debt, individual debts, country debts, and then there needs to be a solution to this unsustainable debt burdens. Now, when we look at how the governments, including the Sri Lankan government, are handling the issues, instead of trying to get the consent of people, workers, in finding solutions to the crisis, what they do, they try to curtail the fundamental rights, democratic standards, attacking the peaceful demonstrators. And this is not acceptable. This is not acceptable. If we are going to go out from the crisis, democracy is key. And people should be able to be given all the rights for peaceful demonstration, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. This is the only way. Another way of handling from the governments, from the employers, using this crisis period to really deteriorate the working conditions, increasing working hours, and bringing much more barriers to unionization. This is also an impasse. This is not the way that this crisis can be the resolved. From that point of view, Industrial Global Union, we really consider very important what is happening in Sri Lanka. Once again, we express our full support and solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Sri Lanka in their fight for democracy, for fundamental rights, but also for a sustainable economy. And this is our very clear commitment. And I am sure that even this webinar is already an important indication of solidarity from Asia Pacific region, from the whole family of Industrial Global Union. Comrades, sisters and brothers, let's fight together. because today's system, today's world is not bearable, is not sustainable, is not viable. And if we speak up, if we stand up, and then if we fight back together, and then we will certainly the win. And let's continue to give our full support and solidarity our brothers, sisters in Sri Lanka. Over back to you, comrade, sister Apurva.
Thank you very much. I just want to tell everyone that we have time to discuss later, so I would like you to keep your patience and let us first have the presentations from our Sri Lankan colleagues, and then we will have time to discuss amongst ourselves. So thank you for understanding. May I now, we are quite early, so that's a good thing. So we have much more time for discussion. So can I call on Comrade Swastika to speak to us? Swastika? Just give us a minute, please.
She can't hear.
Swastika, if you want to speak, please unmute yourself. You are in mute.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you very clearly. So thank you.
I can't hear anything. So
you have you connected to your computer audio, Swastika? Is your volume on? Is your volume high?
I'm just going to talk, even though I can't hear any of you. Is that okay? If you can type and
Swastika?
I'm just going to proceed with my presentation, even though I can't hear any of you. Okay, fine. I'm going to do that.
Swastika, you're now muted.
Since we in 2000 and this April this year, one of the features on the ground, we saw fuel shortages and electricity shortages, which actually fueled, in fact, that is what fueled the Aragali or the struggle, which went on for several months in Gulf phase. And the government brought this struggle to an end, or rather it crushed it with military. My presentation keeps getting muted, but let me just try and continue to speak. So the government in July 2022, on July 22nd, they brought the military and they completely crushed the protest, the peaceful struggle, which and the main slogan was that the president at that time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, should go home. But since then, we also had a discussion about this few weeks ago with Industrial as well. But since then, I'm just going to speak about what we are seeing on the ground in terms of the working situation, the working conditions, in terms of the food crisis and how it has been affecting people, and what the government has proposed in terms of budget 2023. So since the end of the struggle, we have heard reports. The UN report already is there in terms of people being food insecure, nearly 6.3 million people being food insecure. And on the ground, what it means is that the teachers union has reported that several children are coming to school and they're fainting. And even yesterday we had a meeting with teachers, where the teachers were saying that we are unable to teach because the crisis, or the burden of the crisis is making them unable to function in a proper way, and education is getting affected. The other thing, of course, is wages have stagnated. Export sector companies have been reporting profits, and yet this has not translated on the ground in rise in wages. So wages have stagnated, and the unions, particularly the private sector unions, have been demanding for a wage increase, particularly because after the rupee devaluation, the margin of profits, or the profits, have increased for export sector companies. So despite the fact that we have been demanding for a wage increase, export sector has stubbornly refused to even increase a rupee in terms of the minimum wage, and the minimum wage of the country still remains as it is what it was 2 years ago before the crisis. So the other thing which unions have, particularly the United Federation of Labor, which I represent, what we have found is that companies have, export sector companies have refused to repatriate their profits back into the country, thereby also fueling the dollar crisis further. And recently the central bank has come out and said that they're going to start naming and shaming companies which are not repatriating their income. And despite all of this, the companies have continued to park their profits outside the country. And the central bank had said it's less than 20% of the residual income which companies have been bringing back, the export sector companies have been bringing back into the country. So this also has fueled the crisis, and this also largely shifts the burden on the export sector, which our country largely relies on in terms of exports on garments, exports. Further can you hear me now? Right. The other thing which currently what we are seeing in Sri Lanka is that the budget which has been presented for 2023, this budget has been described by economists as the IMF budget, because it talks about austerity measures, it talks about privatization, it talks about labor law reforms, particularly in terms of a single labor law, which the government is being hoping to present in Parliament. Hoping to present in Parliament next year. And history has shown us, in terms of single labor law, when governments, even looking at the Indian experience, history has shown us that when governments try to oversimplify labor laws, it often results in labor regimes which are anti-labor, which are anti-labor, and which removes protection which currently exists for our workforce. And then, of course, the budget, the largest expenditure in our budget, which has been presented for 2023, despite the fact that there is malnutrition, despite the fact that food inflation is nearly 80%, and despite the fact that workers are struggling in terms of food cost and transport cost and so on, the budget allocation has been the largest amount of budget allocations have been for defense and for public highways. So this is the insensitivity in which the government is dealing with the current crisis. And in terms of the private sector, because I also represent a private sector union, one of the things which we have seen is that the private sector blowing hot and cold. On the one hand, they are saying they are struggling with the crisis. They are also victims of this crisis. But on the other hand, we also see, for instance, when we had a recent discussion with brands facilitated by Industrial, brands are not saying, or buyers are not saying that they're going to pull out of Sri Lanka. But when we ask for wage hikes, what companies saying is we are also struggling, brands are going to pull out, suppliers are going to pull out, and so on and so forth. And this hot and cold position of the private sector has resulted in a very precarious position in terms of the demands which unions can also put forward in times of this crisis. So one of the things which we can ask for, which we want to ask for in terms of from Sri Lankan perspective to a global union like Industrial, one of the things which we want to ask for is what is the nature of what is happening in terms of value chain production or value chain profits when a country like Sri Lanka goes into a crisis, when everything is in a state of disarray, when companies claim that they are making losses, while when we look at their books, it seems as if they are making profits. So what happens in terms of in terms of where is this profit, or where is this profits being parked in a state when a country is in a state of crisis like what we are seeing in Sri Lanka now. Sri Lanka is in a deep crisis. This is unprecedented, and yet we see companies and buyers making profits even during this crisis while wages have stagnated. So one of the things which we want to understand and learn is when a country is in a state of crisis like what we find in Sri Lanka, what is happening to the production and what is happening to the profits, and who is benefiting out of this crisis, even while our workers struggle with stagnating wages or with falling real wages. Thank you, and sorry about the technical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Swastika. I don't think you can hear us, but we will. I'll check. I'll send you a message. That was a good introduction. I will now ask Ahilan Kadirgamar, who is a senior lecturer in the University of Jaffna, to speak to us about this. Comrade Ahilan, we have a lot of time for you. So we had initially factored in about 15 to 20 minutes of your presentation, followed by about 15 minutes of discussion before we move on to Anton. But we do have a lot more time, so please feel free to talk more. Thank you. Okay. I hope you are able to hear and we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Apurva, and all of you for inviting me to make a presentation. Now I'm going to talk about the crisis, one, how we got here, and what does the future look like, particularly for labor and the working people. And maybe I must also say, in addition to being an academic senior lecturer at the university, I'm also the vice president of the Federation of University Teachers Associations. So I'm also involved in trade union work in terms of our university trade union. And I'm also the chairman of the Northern Cooperative Development Bank, which is the federation of all cooperative societies in the Northern Province. So these issues of working people are issues that I work regularly on. Now, Sri Lanka, as all of you know, is going through an unprecedented crisis. We are looking at our GDP contracting by 1/10 this year. Even the World Bank says that there's going to be negative 9.2% GDP growth in Sri Lanka in 2022. The World Bank estimates that GDP is going to contract further by 4.2%. So negative 4.2% growth next year. This is what I think all over the world happened during the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're already seeing the devastating impact. People in many rural or urban shanty towns are only eating 1 meal a day. Malnutrition is on the rise, and we are going to lose a generation if this continues. And I will come back to it, but as per the recent budget that was announced by the President and Finance Minister, there is no effort to change this trajectory. There's no stimulus for the economy. and there is no relief to the people. So what the World Bank thinks is going to be negative 4.2%, I would say is going to be much higher contraction next year, and the economic devastation is going to continue. How did we get here? This crisis has been in the making for a long time. I would trace it back to 1977-78, when Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy, to go through neoliberal reforms, what are called the open economy policies in Sri Lanka, along with which we started to liberalize trade. We liberalized the flow of capital into the country, which also meant that capital could fly out of the country. And to carry those forward, the Prime Minister at that time, J.R. Jayawardena, created the Office of the Executive President to concentrate all powers under one individual. They brought about the Prevention of Terrorism Act so that they could deny people their rights. A state of emergency was brought about, and all that was used to crush trade unions. The general strike of July 1980 was completely crushed. Tens of thousands of workers were put out of jobs. And the trade union movement to date has not recovered of that particular attack. And that continued amidst the largest development project in Sri Lanka, funded by the World Bank, the Accelerated Mahabali scheme, where they diverted a river towards irrigation at huge cost, and that began the debt-driven economy of Sri Lanka. They pushed for urbanization and a focus on building the garment sector. And so what we are facing now in terms of the structure of our economy, all that was begun in the late 1970s and early 80s, along with the kind of repression. And that repression and militarization is what led to a civil war in Sri Lanka against the Tamil minority. And the civil war, ironically, meant that they couldn't take the neoliberal policies as in an accelerated fashion, because then they were focused on fighting a war and building a military. The end of the war in May 2009 then led to what I call a second wave of neoliberalism. Greater financialization of the economy. It is around that time that Sri Lanka started to float sovereign bonds in the international capital markets. Sovereign bonds on the order of $500 million US dollars to $1 billion US dollars at very high interest rates. These are floated in London and New York in the international capital markets, with an average interest rate of 7.5% for a dollar-denominated bond, which are often repaid in 5 or 10 years. Now, if a sovereign bond for $1 billion is floated for 10 years, by the time we repay that bond, the interest payment becomes equal to the principal. We did not get any returns like that. All of this was used for urbanization and the beautification of Colombo, to import luxury goods for the elite, to build real estate and hotels. None of that was providing returns. Now, 10 years ago, many of us started writing the unsustainability of this second wave of neoliberal reforms, that it was going to lead to a crisis. But our policymakers, with the support of organizations like the IMF, in 2009, July, Sri Lanka went into a standby IMF agreement of 2.6 billion US dollars, which gave Sri Lanka the green card the green light to go and borrow in these international capital markets. So we borrowed extensively. And Sri Lanka was able to show through such investment, in luxurious investment in real estate, 8% GDP growth in 2010, 11, and 12. And we were considered a post-war booming economy, cheered on by the international actors. But as that bubble started to peter out, we had a change of government in 2015 with the current president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, as prime minister. And in 2016, June, we went for another IMF agreement, a $1.5 billion extended fund facility. In June, we got that IMF agreement. In July, we went and floated $1.5 billion worth of sovereign bonds again, and many more billions in the next few years. The debt was unsustainable. We were headed towards a crisis. And in 2020, with the pandemic, our tourism earnings were disrupted, migrant remittances were disrupted. We knew we were headed into a very serious crisis. 2.5 years ago, I was writing that we are headed towards a balance of payment crisis, but the government did nothing to address it. The Rajapaksa government did nothing to address it. They continued with unrestricted imports. They only restricted the import of automobiles because they were wedded to the free trade ideology that imports should not be restricted even if our foreign reserves keep dropping. And that was what led to the great economic crisis early this year. By the time they decided to go to the IMF early this year, and this is, let me remind you, the 17th IMF agreement that Sri Lanka is going into. And today we are told that this is the solution. They're not saying it's the 17th solution. They are saying this is the solution to Sri Lanka's economic crisis, and we should do whatever the IMF asks us to do. We were already in an economic crisis where our foreign reserves had collapsed. The war in Ukraine meant that global commodity prices, including oil, fertilizers, wheat, various commodities, were doubling, if not tripling in costs in some cases. And by the time they decided, it was too late, but they started implementing the IMF's recommendations, which are the same recommendations that were there in 2016, which were the recommendations made public by an IMF staff report in March this year. What did it entail? Sudden devaluation of the rupee, which we did in March. The Sri Lankan rupee was devalued from 200 rupees to $1 to 360 rupees. In other words, if a kilogram of wheat flour costs 200 rupees, suddenly it costs 360 rupees, 80% more. And all that was passed on to the consumer. But the timing was such that there was also increase in global prices. So it wasn't just 360 rupees. People had to probably pay 600 rupees. So the price of bread today compared to a year ago is 4 times. A loaf of bread, which used to cost 60 rupees, depending on the place, cost between 200 and 300 rupees, a loaf of bread. The next recommendation was to increase interest rates. The central bank increased its policy rate from 6% to 15.5%, 2.5 times, which meant working capital has become unaffordable because the actual lending rates of the banks, when they put on their cost of capital and risk, is anywhere between 20 to 30%. So we are seeing many SMEs go bankrupt and unemployment is going through the roof. But our data doesn't capture that, because according to our Census and Statistics Department, even if you work 1 hour a month, you are considered employed. So don't look at the data on unemployment. We have a serious unemployment crisis where our workers are being thrown out of jobs. Even our farmers cannot borrow because interest rates are so much higher. We had the fertilizer crisis last year on top of that. And therefore, we are also seeing food production on the decline. Another IMF recommendation is to market price energy. What does that mean? Fuel, diesel that costs 100 rupees or petrol that costs 150 rupees, this year was suddenly raised to somewhere between 400 and 460 rupees. A threefold increase in the price of petrol and diesel, and all that transferred to the consumers. So workers who have to travel their transportation costs have tripled or quadrupled. Small farmers use has quadrupled. This is what market pricing has meant. And the distribution of fuel this year in October compared to January is 50%. In other words, there's only 50% of the fuel that was being consumed in January is being consumed now because of this huge price hike. No wonder the economy is in free fall. If you have no fuel, no transportation, or it's limited, the economy is going to collapse. Austerity measures where the government is forced to balance its budget meant that the private sector is not investing, individuals can't spend because they have no money, and the government has stopped all government works. So any kind of informal work, day wage labor, mason work, work in the construction sector, all that has come to a halt. So this is the kind of very serious crisis that we are going through. But while the crisis was in the making, what I'm saying is that in March, when the government decided to go to the IMF and start implementing the IMF's recommendations, that has had a huge repressive effect on the economy. What does this mean? Food inflation is 90%. General inflation is 60%. But workers' wages have remained the same, or they have lost their jobs, or working people, their livelihoods have been disrupted. So it's actually much less. A recent FAO and World Food Program report says, which came out in September, that 40% of our people, their incomes have reduced by 50%. So incomes have reduced for them by 50%. Their food costs have almost doubled, 90% food inflation. So this is the cost of the IMF agreement. In other words, with 60% inflation and no wage increase by 40%. And this is what our workers and our working people are facing. And they are having to sacrifice food. Their children, as Swastika mentioned, are going to school and fainting. So there's a semblance of a society and an economy working, but economically, we are in free fall. Now, what does the next part of my talk, the second part, what does the future look like? We are continuing on the path of the IMF. The IMF has a very simple logic. They said to gain the IMF agreement, there's only a staff level agreement between the Sri Lankan government and the IMF. Only the IMF staff have agreed to an agreement which is not public. And they say that they will, once the IMF board approves this, Sri Lanka will get 2.9 billion US dollars over 4 years. But that release of those funds and the IMF approval, they say, has two main conditions. One, in 2 years' time, by 2025, Sri Lanka should have a primary surplus. What does a primary surplus mean? In terms of the government budget, revenues should be more than expenditure. The second condition, Sri Lanka in April this year defaulted on its external debt. That Sri Lanka should restructure its debt with its donors, the bilateral donors and its commercial lenders. Now, Sri Lanka, people talk about a Chinese debt trap, but if you look at the numbers, 53% of Sri Lanka's external debt is commercial borrowing. It's basically hedge funds, multinational banks, and 40% of that total debt is negotiate with the bondholders. And they also have to negotiate with major bilateral donors, particularly China and Japan, which each hold about 10% of our government's external debt. Now, that the way in which we defaulted itself is a concern. The neoliberal establishment in Sri Lanka pushed for a premature default. In April this year, we only had to pay 78 million US dollars in interest payments. The next major debt repayment was at the end of July, on July 25th, when we had to repay a 1 billion US dollar sovereign bond. So why did we default on April 11th? Because the neoliberal establishment, the central bank, and the finance ministry thought once Sri Lanka defaults, it has no option but to go to the IMF. Maybe they knew this, or maybe they were naive. They thought debt restructuring would happen overnight, and an IMF agreement would be there by July. Now, the earliest that the IMF agreement is going to come is in March, provided Sri Lanka meets both these conditions. What I understand, there's been no progress in terms of debt restructuring because our creditors are going to hold us to ransom. They know we are desperate. They are not going to give us a haircut, which means they are not going to reduce the amount of capital that we have to repay or give us better terms, longer term, lower interest repayment of the debt. But Sri Lanka is implementing the first IMF condition towards a primary surplus. And that is what was reflected in the budget that was announced last month for 2023. There is no stimulus, no relief. And overnight, the government claims we are going to raise revenue so high and bring our primary budget deficit down to 0.7%. It was 5.6% in 2021. In 2022, they claim it's going to be 4%. How are they going to bring it down to 0.7%? Impossible. What they're going to do is they're going to stop government spending and then squeeze as much taxes. And the easiest tax for them is the indirect value-added tax, which the working people pay. This means the situation next year is going to be disastrous. But the only concern of the government is to meet the IMF conditions. And this amidst a food crisis, where the supply of food is low, prices are on the rise, and people have no relief. So on the one hand, it seems like madness. This is the lesson we should have learned from the Great Depression of the 1930s, but we haven't. The debt restructuring process is out of Sri Lanka's hands. There is a global game that is being played because Sri Lanka is one of the first countries to default. And I am part of the International Development Economists Associates, which is a network of economists from the global south. My colleagues in Ghana, my colleagues in Zambia, my colleagues in Latin America, we know that over 30 countries are facing debt problems, such as what Sri Lanka is facing. Many of them may default. So there's a global tussle. The Americans want to put pressure on the Chinese to restructure debt because they know that will be a precedent for other countries. The Chinese won't want to restructure the debt because if they do it for Sri Lanka, they'll have to do it for many other countries. The IMF wants to have the same model of austerity for other countries, so they are not going to release the funds. So Sri Lanka is caught in a game that is not just Sri Lanka's game, it's a global game as the global economy goes into a recession and as the global economic order is shifting. But there is an underlying logic to this. What we are seeing in Sri Lanka is tremendous wage repression. Many of our trade unions, people like Swastika, have been active in taking on state repression, political repression, but there hasn't been enough attention paid to the economic repression underway. As I mentioned already, real wages have reduced by 40%. Much more. As companies collapse, we are going to see the expansion of what Marx called the reserve army of labor. People without work, looking for work, who will work for half the wages. Because Sri Lanka is continuing on the neoliberal path, the export-led economic model. And if this continues, after this huge crisis and after starvation, and people die of starvation and famines that might ravage the country, we would have very low wages in Sri Lanka. And for our capitalist class and for global capital, there will be room to make huge profits because our wage costs would be so low. That is the dangerous logic underneath this madness. And what is happening to inequality? Our working people are having to pawn their jewelry for now 25% or 30% interest rate, and they're going to lose their assets. The wealthier classes, their assets, their value in rupees are continuing to rise. So wealth inequality is continuing to rise amidst this crisis. So it is in the interest of our elite, while it is devastating for our working people. I will end with reinforcing what Swastika suggested. I work with the fishing community in the north, and the fishing community in the north are involved in seafood exports. Blue swimming crab, which used to be purchased from a fisher folk for 2,700 rupees, is now being purchased by these seafood exporting companies for 1,800 or 1,600 rupees. It's just baffling. because we saw the devaluation of the rupee from 200 rupees to $1 to 360 rupees. In other words, what was 2,700 rupees should be purchased for 80% more, for 4,000 rupees. But no, it's being bought for a third of the price. What is behind this? Who is making the profit here? Our fisher folk. Their price of kerosene oil is fourfold. They used to pay 85 rupees. Now they're paying 360 rupees for a liter of kerosene. So their cost of production has gone up. Their incomes have declined. This is true in the garment sector. This is true in tea exports. And this is true in agricultural exports. I think something concrete that a global union like IndustriALL can do, which would be a great act of solidarity, is to perhaps focus on these 4 value chains: garments, tea, seafood, and agricultural commodity exports, and make it public what's happening to these value chains. Is it the local Sri Lankan exporters who are raking in the profits? What is happening to the importers on the other side? Because it's clear to us there is huge repression of the incomes of our workers and working people. Sri Lanka is going through tremendous hardship. In my view, this crisis is going to last another 5 to 10 years. We have to prepare for the long haul, because the other program of the government is to sell our state assets, privatize the Ceylon Electricity Board, more of Sri Lanka Telecom, all our utilities. This would undermine what were very high human development indicators in Sri Lanka historically. Sri Lanka was a model because of our free education, free healthcare, and various other social welfare schemes. And what is at stake over the next 5 to 10 years is selling these assets so that we can repay bondholders in the West. And this will change the trajectory of Sri Lanka unless the workers' movement in Sri Lanka decides to respond and stop this madness. And the solidarity of trade unions around the world is crucial at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahilan. That was extremely informative and you know, for all of us in economies and struggling economies, much food for thought to see how we need to go beyond thinking about opening up our markets and, you know, the debates that have been part of economic circles since the 80s and 90s. Because this was a little technical, so to speak. Any questions that people have? I think we have about 15 minutes just on this to just talk, and after which we will invite our comrade Anton to speak. But if there are any questions on this specifically, I would encourage people to ask now. Takakura-san, do you want to make a comment?
Ahilan-san, thank you very much for your very, very detailed explanation. I could clearly understand what is actually happening, and nothing is functioning, it seems, politically and economically. And of course, we have to improve the situation. But today's news tells us that the World Bank has decided to lend to Sri Lanka. But not only the loan, but other, for example, technical assistance and other assistance will be necessary, I believe. But what sort of effective assistance are you looking for and are you expecting?
Maybe we take a couple more comments and then we. Anybody else? Any comments on the presentation of Comrade Ahilan? Yes, Ravi Shankar Pandey, please.
Thanks, Comrade Apurva. Am I audible? Yeah.
Yes.
That was a very fantastic report. And I could better understand about the Sri Lankan present scenario rather than getting it from social medias and other. They were not giving us the right background of the present scenario of economic condition. Well, I have a question, sir. Could you please tell us what is the role of agriculture? What agriculture can, what farming can play, how to improve such conditions? Because in India also, when there was a very big famine, in Lal Bahadur, our former Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri's regime, he had requested all our Indians to even utilize a mat of land that is provided or available anywhere, even in the jungle, beyond the railway lines, and somewhere, whatever. He had requested to crop any vegetable, any fast yielding varieties of foods or something like that, so that within 3 or 6 months, we could be at least sustainable in the matters of food and crops. So is there any drive, such drives, or can industry all encourage such campaign for doing such so? Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi Shankar. Maybe Ahilan, we take these first two, if you have any.
Yeah. Thank you, Takakura-san. This is an important question. As I mentioned in my presentation, the IMF agreement is only for 2.9 billion US dollars over 4 years, which is an average of only 60 million US dollars per month. What the World Bank provides, or the Asian Development Bank, and I think Japan is a big donor to both agencies, is a few hundred million US dollars each year. Now, Sri Lanka's foreign earnings every month is on the order of 1,500 million US dollars to 1,800 million US dollars. But our imports are even higher. So compared to, so in 1 month, we earn 1,500 to 1,800 million US dollars. The entire IMF agreement over 4 years is only 2,900 million US dollars. What the World Bank will give is only few hundred million US dollars. So if you look at the scale, what the neoliberal establishment is saying is, we have to get an IMF agreement, we will get some funds from the World Bank, but really they are saying we have to go back and borrow again in the commercial markets. That is what got us in the debt trap in the first place. And this time around, it'll be at much higher interest rates. I said an average of 7.5%, where in 10 years, the interest is equal to the principal. The reality is now, if you go to the international capital markets, it'll be 30% interest rate each year. So it's not a solution. So what is the government actually going to do? they are going to sell our assets, which is the wealth of the people. Sri Lanka has 99% electricity access, very different from rest of the global south. 99% of the people have access to the electricity grid. And a year ago, 60% of the people, their average electricity bill was only $1.50 US a month. Now, what is going to happen when you privatize? There's going to be darkness at night for maybe a majority of the households, but they won't be able to afford electricity. That is what is at stake here. So we are seeing a lot of statements by the IMF, the World Bank, but there is a big lie being told to the people of Sri Lanka in terms of the economic path forward. And the people who are going to be affected are the working people in this country. What's happened to agriculture? Since liberalization in the 1970s, we've seen a steady decline in investment in agriculture. International agencies, unfortunately, including the International Labour Organization, has been taking forward neoliberal policies in Sri Lanka. They have been pushing our farmers to get into monocropping and connect it to the private sector for cash crops for agricultural exports without considering food self-sufficiency or food sovereignty or food security. And that is also a reason for the huge food crisis. We are facing a crisis in our food system. And one of the reasons for it is this push. Same with fisheries. I work with fishermen and farmers. Every year, until 2 years ago, we export $250 million US worth of seafood. Mainly high value seafood like blue swimming crab and sea cucumber. But we also import $200 million US of seafood, dry fish, sprats. 80% of our animal food protein is seafood. Now with this economic crisis, we don't have foreign exchange to import the seafood that our working people eat. So we are going to face malnutrition. But this was the direction in which our agricultural policies were over the last few decades. And sadly, many international agencies, including the UN agencies, have pushed our farmers in that direction. Comrade Ravi, I'm not sure I answered your question. You had a more specific question. If you can repeat that, I can quickly.
No, somewhat I got the answer. But what is the country doing, or what is the projected plan in the field of agriculture so that the country can survive in terms of food? What is the projected plan?
There is no plan. If you read the budget, there is no plan. Last year was a disastrous, sudden policy by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, where he banned the import of chemical fertilizers overnight. And we had this year, because of that, our agricultural output is down by 40%. Our food output is down by 40% at a time when we don't have foreign exchange to import food. And there's no stimulus for agriculture in this budget. Until last year, our farmers used to pay 1,400 rupees for a 50 kilo bag of urea. Right now, the government is supplying on a quota basis urea to farmers after this whole chemical fertilizer crisis on a quota basis, but at 10,000 rupees a bag, right? 7 or 8 times the price. So how are the farmers going to recover profits or get an income? They're going to run at a loss. So there is no program to address the agriculture production crisis.
I think Comrade Ahilan is frozen actually.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No,
I actually do have a comment, Comrade. I mean, I know that it is quite immature to ask for, what is the way forward, because this is the crisis that has been exacerbated by policies that have been relentlessly followed for years at the cost of working people. But I do know that there were, for example, there was quite a strong pitch during the Gota Go Back, when that time, that we should say no to IMF. But obviously there is money needed in the country. There has to be some money, and to be used for working people, whatever, and not dependent on, exploiting working people through taxes or high prices, to make the country run. So is there some kind of thinking around what could change? I mean, of course, the government will have to take a stand on it and, whatever, but is there any kind of demands from civil society on, this is how we need to go? Is there something? Thank you.
there are disparate ideas, but let me put some of the ideas that some of us have been thinking about. First of all, what I mentioned was in April, a premature default. It was a very clear strategy to reduce Sri Lanka's bargaining power with respect to the IMF. Right? Once you default, you're completely at the mercy of the IMF. So first, we should recognize that this was a very insidious strategy to lock Sri Lanka into this position, and there is yet to be a debate within Sri Lanka and accountability for this kind of move, right? Now, secondly, what is the alternative? Now, my view is whether we go to the IMF or not, whether we get that IMF agreement or now is a moot point. We're already implementing the IMF's recommendations. Even if we get that IMF agreement, that $2.9 billion is not going to make a big difference. Probably 3 years from now, we will go for another IMF agreement and another agreement, right? This is what we have seen happen in Argentina. We've seen it happen in many countries. But there's this illusion that this is the final IMF agreement, the 17th, but the final. Some magic number, 17, that's going to solve all problems for Sri Lanka, right? Now, what would be the alternative and what should working people demand? First and foremost, we are really worried about the food crisis. We're already seeing signs of starvation. We could be facing a famine, and that's going to be devastating. We're going to lose a generation to malnutrition. So food security is of utmost importance, but food security doesn't mean importing rice from India and China. Okay, we're going to import next year, we're going to import the following year and the third year. We have to have an agriculture strategy of stimulus to make sure farmers produce, you subsidize that, and you get higher production so that we reach self-sufficiency in food. But the international actors, the government in power, they are against any idea of self-sufficiency. They want the free trade regime to continue even in agriculture. So that is first. Two, what we are seeing is volatility in prices. When you go through this kind of an economic crisis, traders are going to hoard, right? Goods become inaccessible to people. You need a strong public distribution system. Other countries have a public distribution system. Sri Lanka, until the 1970s, until the launch of neoliberal policies, we did have a very good public distribution system. All essentials should be imported by the government, and distributed through cooperatives or other semi-state agencies so that people get these goods at a fair price. Agricultural produce should be purchased at a fair price and distributed to the people. So we need a public distribution system that goes along with this agricultural stimulus. The question will come up, but where are you going to get the money? That is the argument of the neoliberals. Where are you going to get the money? Even in this budget, they have huge targets of raising revenues. It won't happen. What will happen?
I think Comrade Ahilan's, yeah, we didn't, Ahilan, we didn't get after your third, you're back now, but I think you should start your third point from the beginning. Thank you. On the, where will we get the money? I think that's where we lost you. Okay.
Yeah, so we are going through a power cut. One of the consequences of the economic crisis, frequent power cuts. Where will we get the money? Even the targets for revenues in this budget are not going to be met. What will happen is they are almost saying there's going to be an 80% increase in revenues next year, which is impossible. What they will do is, compared to what the allocations are, there will be a 40% drop in the government expenditure. What they will do is, and this is what our treasury is very good at doing, they make grand claims in the budget, and when the revenues don't come, they keep reducing the expenditure. When people have less, there's less stimulus for the economy continues to collapse. Where will we get the money? There has to be, during the Great Depression, is the lesson from the 1930s. That's where there was a whole shift in economic policy. A government has to borrow and spend. One, government can borrow domestically, not international borrowing. That's not going to come. Government can borrow from its citizens, from the banks locally, and it has to spend, it has to provide relief because private sector is not investing. When the economy is collapsing, private sector is not going to invest, private individuals are not going to invest. But there's an even more better strategy, which there is no political will on the part of the government, is we need a wealth tax. Because during a downturn, incomes, even profits of most companies, except the export companies, are going to decrease. Income is a flow that year, and that's going to decline when the GDP is contracting by 10%. But wealth is accumulated over years and decades, and over the last 4.5 decades, inequality in Sri Lanka has increased. The wealthy have become much more wealthy. It is their wealth, they didn't earn it. Our working people earned all these export earnings and they squandered it, buying luxury cars and building huge houses and hotels. So it's now time to repay. So there should be a huge wealth tax that redistributes wealth in the form of relief to the people, right? So, and then slowly the government has to shift its policy for the long haul. There needs to be an industrial policy for local production, to create local. I work with the cooperatives in the north. We have many small industries under the cooperatives. The wealth can be generated for the people, and whatever is accumulated then becomes the people's wealth when it's done through cooperatives. We need policies like that, but that is in the medium term. But immediately address the food crisis, a public distribution system, and redistribution, particularly through a wealth tax. But we know the current government won't do that. The next government may not do that, but the working people have to keep struggling, and we might, as we saw in Greece, many changes in governments before the right kind of policies can be brought about to address the concerns of the working people.
Thank you, Comrade. That was a really, really good presentation, and I'm sure I all my colleagues here, comrades here join me in thanking you for giving us this time. It was really good. I will now ask Anton. We will have more discussions following this, but I would like to have Anton come in and talk to us about trade unions' roles and responses and how we could build on that going forward. Anton?
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And first of all, I would like to thank Comrade Island. He gave a clear picture about the present situation. And as trade unions, actually, you know that we just after COVID and during the COVID, we trade union played a major role to minimize the damage. And for instance, when the employers, apparel sector employers wanted to dismiss 500,000 employees, we were able to minimize that for 150,000, because 150,000 workers lost their employment. So because of our tripartite intervention, and because we believe that when a crisis like this, we need a more and more strong social dialogue. That is the only way we will be able to find solutions. So similarly, when this crisis came up, when we met the Prime Minister, then Prime Minister, now he is the President, in July 1st, the trade unions who met, we proposed that there should be another tripartite task force to intervene in this situation. In fact, immediately the Prime Minister instructed to the Minister of Labour to set up that. And then the Minister of Labour, and in the meantime, we discussed about the wage increase, because we have requested 1,000 rupees per day and 26,000 rupees per month, because whereas now we are getting only 16,000 rupees per month. And that matter also we discussed with the Prime Minister. And then when the 5th July, when the minister called a National Labour Advisory Council, that's the tripartite body, and we discussed. And before that, we knew that the employers and the government are going to use this situation to bring labor law reforms. And the NLAC unions, there are 14 unions. Out of 14, 11 are working together, and all the affiliates, industrial affiliates, are with us. And we wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Labour stating that we do not want to see that any of the labor law reforms will bring this situation, because the trade unions are busy to support their members. So we are not in a position to discuss any of labor law reform. Despite our request, on 5th July, when met the NLAC, the minister wanted to pass a new labor law reforms related to the the Shop and Office Act, allowing these call centers, female workers to employ after 10 p.m. Actually, we said we are not representing them. We need time to consult them, whether they wanted to or not. But without, considering our request to postpone this, he passed that labor law reform. And then we immediately met again trade unions and sent a letter expressing our displeasure, the way he conducted the meeting. And after that, we found that by some of the labor, newspaper carried that minister has instructed to the labor ministry to change the labor law related to the working hours of the female, the overtime hours. According to our law, only 60 hours allowed per month. The minister wanted to increase to 75 hours. And similarly, the night work. And then we thought that something going on. And immediately the trade union wrote to the minister and asked for a discussion and requested him to call a meeting of National Labour Advisory Council. But he did not respond. And then the trade union decided to go and meet him. We informed him in writing and we went there, but minister was not there. And then, but only the private secretary met us, but private secretary did not want to discuss with us. And instead he said, no need to talk to the trade unions. When we want to labor law reforms, we can do it. If employees are ready to accept, if the employers want, then we can go ahead without talking to the unions. So that we knew that there's something going on inside the labor ministry. And then we immediately sent a letter to the labor minister and requested immediately to call a NLAC meeting. From after 5th of July, according to the National Labor Advisory Council constitution, at least once a month there should be a meeting. But he did not call a meeting, no reasons why he did not call. And then trade unions were continuously campaigning, demanding that there should be a National Labor Advisory Council. But in the meantime, as discussed with the Prime Minister, Minister appointed a task force, tripartite task force, which we said that it is a subcommittee of the National Labor Advisory Council. So we need first meet the National Labor Advisory Council. But he called a task force without calling the NLAC. So the trade unions members who were nominated to the task force, we decided not to participate. But then what happened? The minister had a meeting with the employers' representatives and the ILO Sri Lanka office representative. And they had a meeting without any trade unions representation. So that is the signal we got it, that means they are ready to go ahead without consulting unions. So we immediately we sent a protest letter. At the same time, on 21st of October, we had a public rally to protest against the minister's behavior. And we passed resolutions accordingly. So trade unions were preparing for the situation, and actually we were compelled to make a complaint to the ILO because the National Labor Advisory Council is a result of Convention 144 of the ILO, because they had to follow the principles of ILO Convention 144. When the ministry behaved like this, so we submitted a complaint to the ILO against the violation of the principles of ILO Convention 144. In the meantime, we were demanding the workers to, because the 16,000 rupees per month is nothing now. And as Comrade Highland mentioned, that 40% reduction of the real wages. And so when we asked for 26,000 rupees based on 1,000 rupees per day, the government can't say no because it has been given to the plantation sector. But employers opposed to that at the 5th of July meeting. And finally, they proposed 21,000. We said, no, we don't want to accept. But they agreed to. Both employers and the labor ministry agreed to increase the 21,000. But until now, they did not bring any legislation to implement that decision. But they brought a new labor law reforms. And so we are trade unions are now, campaigning against this situation, because when we demand this, there should be a tripartite, genuine consultation to face this situation. So the trade union now, the plan. If you go to the grassroots level, workers are really affected very badly. They, 16,000 rupees per month means $42 per month. And what the workers can do, because they were managing with the overtime and attendant bonus, and then, the incentive payment. Now the factories, employers claim that they don't have orders. So the workers don't get overtime, don't get attendant bonus, don't get incentive payment. So they have to manage with the, the minimum wage they were receiving. So some workers, they don't take anything to eat at night. They take something, but then the workers are really badly affected. And when there is no cooking gas, this majority of the workers are living in private boarding houses. So how can they prepare the meals in the room like 10 by 10? So they can't do anything. So the trade unions, the unions has to support them. So we started a program called Solidarity Kitchen Program in order to encourage them to cooking together and talking together and fighting together. So this is not a humanitarian support, but this is to encourage them to, working together. So in this situation, now we, NLSE unions, we call the union of all the unions, because what we found is the public sector unions are fighting separately and the farmers are fighting against separately. Farmers are, and the fisheries are fighting against separately. In the same time, the trade unions also divided, because some political groups are divided the trade union, and once one group fight called a strike, and another day other group called another strike. So what the what trade unions did, we called a meeting of all the unions, including public sector and the same, semi-government sector unions last Friday. And now we have agreed that there should be a, the broader alliance among the trade unions to fight back of this. Because in the meantime, when the government brought the budget, where Comrade Highland mentioned, they brought labor law reforms. One of the reforms is they wanted to compile all the labor laws into one law. And this was brought it in 2019. And according to that, they are going to ask workers to work 12 hours per day, not 8 hours per day, 12 hours per day without overtime. And 4 days per week, and then 3 days off without pay. That they call it compressed working week, which all the trade unions opposed to that. And in 2019, they withdrew. But now they are planning to bring back those labor law, new labor law. And at the same time, they are going to propose that now if you have terminate the services of any employee, other than the reasons of disciplinary grounds, you have to pay the compensation. But now they are going to bring a so-called scheme, insurance scheme, which if you terminate the services of any employee, they are going to pay the compensation, which is a contributory compensation. That means workers also have to contribute for their own compensation. And they are going to, bail out the employer paying compensation. So because of this situation, now the trade unions have called all the unions. And of course, now there is an agreement among the unions, the public sector, private sector. Now we are demanding that every, family who have 4 members with less than 70,000 rupees per income per month, they should be given, dry rational parcels, including books for the children to go to schools free of charge. Because we know, as Comrade Island mentioned, 40% of our families are now living under poverty line. So we want to demand that. And at the same time, we demand that this privatization, so-called restructuring process, should not happen until they consult the unions. Particular sector unions has to be consulted, and then only they can take a decision. And the third one question came up with the presentation of Comrade Highland, that where we can find the money. We can find, we have put forward a proposal to how to find. According to one of the ministers, he mentioned in the parliament that there are 105,000 companies who should pay the taxes, but 105,000 companies, only 24,000 companies are paying taxes. That means 75% of the companies do not pay taxes. The government can identify those companies and get that money. Similarly, now the export companies are not bringing back their money to Sri Lanka. They should ask, government should ask them to bring back, so they can get the money to support the poor families. And at the same time, we demanded that the government should do that. And the same time, you know, there is no war now, but the government has allocated similar funds to the defense ministry. And we demand that there is no need to allocate such a big money for the defense, because now they are preparing repression. That is why they want to get more and more money to allocate the defense funds. At the same time, we demanded that this, you know, Prevention of Terrorism Act should be abolished, and no, you know, the police should be a civil department, not like army. So we have in the similar type, you know, we are now discussing the common demands, and we are discussing how plan of action as trade unions join together. So this is what we are demanding. We hope that industrial global unions and their affiliates can support Sri Lankan trade unions to continue this campaign, because there is a severe repression. For instance, now they are planning to even get rid of some of the unions in the National Labour Advisory Council, because the next year, January, they are going to reappoint the members of the National Labour Advisory Council. Now they have brought new condition, which completely against the Freedom of Association Convention 87 and 98. The trade unions are governed by each trade union's constitution. Now the Labor Department is going to take over the powers of each union's constitution, and they are going to dictate terms. In that way, they are going to get rid of some of the unions like us not to be appointed for the next National Labour Advisory Council, because we are coordinating the NLAC trade union. There is a severe repression. Therefore, we need the global support to, you know, fight back against this repression, as well as to win over the demands. We need industry all to, and it's their affiliates to support our struggle. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I had put my camera off because my connection was also a little bit problematic, I see Nathan, our comrade from CMU in Sri Lanka. So Nathan, please. Comrade, you're still muted.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. While agreeing what Comrade Anton mentioned about the situation in the country, especially in the trade union field, we are really taking efforts to bring all trade unions together on common issues, especially the economic issue, as well as the democratic rights of the people and the workers' rights. In the meantime, as Brother Highland mentioned, he very clearly explained the economical situation in the country, and also the government's failure to have a political will to bring the condition under control, and also the issue of how we are going to get money, how you manage your the issues or problems, getting money from how you are going to get. That is one of the serious problems that we have. You know, the Sri Lankan government, the country has become like a state of bankruptcy. So the international community, especially the governments and the funding agents, are very much reluctant to support Sri Lankan government. One reason is about the mismanagement and also corruption. So that is one of the serious issues that we face at the moment. But we are also struggling to find a way how we tackle this situation, and whether we could keep trust on this regime and the people behind it. So there is was a serious complaint against the previous regime and about the corruption and the malpractices of the funds they got, and also the way they spend on the money unproductive. You know, you don't get returns from when you spend money. But my problem is about the ground situation now. You know, employers are very much reluctant to even to sign agreements with collective agreements with trade unions, especially our union. At least 4 companies have already informed us they have to put off the negotiations for collective agreements, and some companies really very much reluctant to even grant even smaller amounts of wage increases, because they say they have a issue about their sustainability. The companies, if they pay workers higher wages, then they have to face serious financial constraint in the future, and also they are not in a position to get a kind of guarantee for their sustainability. And in the meantime, some of the companies even stop paying. This is one of a serious problem, in the sense in December of the month, the workers actually face kind of, otherwise if I say that they need more money to meet additional expenses, especially by school children's needs, books, bags, and textbooks and all kind of things. We did a small kind of the survey, and we found at least people need about 25,000 to meet with the price increases. So all prices of goods and services and other things have gone 3 to 4 times up. So they are not in a position to face the situation. And other problem is about the democracy and the people's rights to raise their voices about their needs. Government is, as Comrade Anton mentioned, and Mr. Brother Island also mentioned, government take measures to even to stop people gathering in public places, using the kind of as I mentioned earlier, it's like a draconian law, anti-terrorism law, that when you take people to the police, they can keep under their custody for more than 3 months. So still it can be continued for the extended for another 3 months. Likewise, this is not a normal law. It's like a draconian law that violates all fundamental rights of the people. So that is one way. Other way, as Brother Anton mentioned, they are trying to put a kind of control or pressure over trade unions in different ways. Now, even today, I got a letter from the Department of Labor coming out with new conditions to become the members of the NLAC. A lot of new conditions, so we had to deal with. But the problem is, we actually, as a trade union, look for immediate relief to our members. That is one way. Other one is the kind of long-term kind of the process, or otherwise to engage with the government with the support of international community. And last week, our executive committee has decided to ask for support from our affiliates, the international affiliates. We have an affiliation with international organizations, and because the members are very much suffering, and they are not in a position to even to meet their day-to-day expenses. Most of the workers, especially workers in the industrial sector, reported they gave up their meals, one-day meal, in some cases 2 meals per day. That is the situation prevailing in our country. Some of the middle class or otherwise white-collar workers, they are not really open. We say that they are like become a state of kind of poverty or starvation, something like that. But we actually look for international organization to consider giving immediate kind of relief. And last week I wrote a letter to another international organization to ask them whether they could consider from international affiliate organizations to support by way of giving school items to children in our country, especially the members of our union. Another way around the trade unions, international affiliates, at least to take up these matters, the Sri Lanka situation with their respective governments. They should ask their respective governments to support Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka people. When you talk about the Sri Lanka, we are not talking about the rulers, but we are talking about the people of this country. So there is an obligation of our affiliates in all over the world should join hand and support Sri Lankan people as well as the workers in this country. So my humble request is the industry all should consider the way of supporting the people, especially the members in our country, by way of giving them some relief, some kind of support, not only the moral, but also the material support, and also to have a global campaign and through our affiliates in other countries to approach their respective governments to take this situation serious and support whatever way they could. Those are the two issues I would like to raise. But in the meantime, we are struggling. Even our membership is in a very difficult condition. And we are actually because we are demand the government, but government say we don't have money. We have to collect of the people through taxations and all kind of things. And they pay increase of, these services like electricity, water, and everything is already increased. Day by day, they coming out with new ideas. So we are actually, honestly speaking, in a confused situation. How we tackle this condition? But in the meantime, we as trade unions have to come together and have a common voice. As Comrade Anton said last week also, we met, and there is differences, For instance, government now come out with the proposal to privatize or sell the government assets. Privatization is the common kind of the demand. And on this issue, the trade unions are divided actually. One group says that it is good to privatize because most of the government establishments are running at a loss. There is no way to come up. So they think it's better to agree for kind of, this privatization. The another group of people say, especially people who are working in those establishments say, no, you don't allow. So we have to have a serious discussion among ourselves and to come to a common kind of agreement and to have a common strong campaign in our country. That's all I want to say. Thank you, Apurva, for giving this opportunity, and also other comrades who joined and raised concern about the Sri Lanka situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. That was also an important intervention. I'm sorry again, my camera is acting up. So I think we've really covered enough that we get an understanding of what is going on in Sri Lanka. Any general comments from everyone before I ask Industrial's leadership to talk about what we could do? So,
Apurva, can you hear me? Palita.
Yeah, but the volume is very faint, Palita. So a little louder, please.
Yeah. Apurva, I endorse what all speakers have been saying, and all this is due to corruption and mismanagement of the government, and mainly the last government. Yeah, it's one family ruined the entire country, and now we are at the mercy of all the, I would say, sharks. Yeah, and even the our big brother, even the partners of the companies of your country, this Adani, he is flying his helicopter regularly to and fro from maybe from Mumbai to Colombo. Yeah, so we are on the verge of total collapse. So in this situation, I support the request of Brother Nathan that we need immediate support. And Apurva, I want you to coordinate that and help that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Palita. Hivon?
Hello, we want you to coordinate and get immediate assistance for our member workers.
Yes, Palita, we heard you loud and clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's all. Thanks.
Yeah. Hewon?
Oh, I was just reflecting in Korea as well. You know that we had our first real general strike in, say, 40 or 50 years in 1996. And that was in response to some government labor law, retrogressive reform of the labor law, and proposed National Security Act. So at the time also, it was part of, I guess, sort of neoliberal reforms. And the trade unions had a platform of demands in Korea, and we went on strike, and an unlimited general strike, and some 70% of the Korean people at that time supported us. At the time, the Korean government withdrew the legal reforms. However, we didn't have sufficient strength among our polity to bring alternate plans forward. And we ended up ultimately still getting a lot of neoliberal reforms. But I was wondering, you mentioned that there was a pan-national trade union meeting last Friday. I was wondering what your common demands that you and your plan or your struggle plan that you made at that meeting was. I guess you didn't agree on a common stance on privatization, although I would like to add just reflecting on what happened in Korea, that privatization also affects a lot of working people and poor people's access to essential public services. So it's not just a question, there's a separate question of rooting out corruption and strengthening democratic control over public services, then whereas just giving it to the private sector might not necessarily bring about that kind of deepening of democracy. But anyway, so the main question was, what have you guys decided among yourselves as your path forward from your meeting last Friday and your common demands?
Thank you, Hewon. Anton, would you just like to quickly answer that so that then we can...
Yeah, I think I already mentioned that when we met on Friday, actually, there was a very good response from the public sector unions also attended. Some of the unions are under, threat of privatization. So what we discuss is now there was a committee has been set up to formulate the necessary demands, to identify the necessary demands. And we are meeting tomorrow to finalize these identified demands, and then call for another meeting with all the other unions and to discuss the plan of actions we are going to take in the future. So that's what we decided. We hope that we will be able to come up with a kind of a, because what we are thinking is to, as it is, as this is not only issues related to the trade union, it's a social issues are being, combined. The people who are in the fisher folk, as well as the farmers and the women, and also, so there is a need of a social movement led by trade unions to overcome this problem. Otherwise, we will not be able to, face these challenges. So this is what we are discussing now. And I think tomorrow the committee will meet, and then there will be another meeting to discuss the further action. Yeah.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you very much. We don't have too much time now left because we also need to kind of conclude, and I'm sure all of you have other engagements post 1 o'clock our time. So may I request Takakura-san to give the closing remarks, and then I will move on to our General Secretary and AGS. Thank you.
本日はですね、スリランカにスポットを当てて、ウェビナーを。
Today, we put a spotlight on Sri Lanka, and thank you very much for your participation, active participation. As mentioned before, the food prices, energy prices, everything is going up. very rapidly. We are faced with the same situation in Japan. But of course, in Sri Lanka, there are so many aspects involved or included. And of course, who's suffering are the working people, and they are the ones who are suffering the most. So I think we have to show solidarity as industry all, and what sort of assistance we can give to Sri Lanka as industry all, we have to really ascertain. And with your cooperation, we'd like to keep showing solidarity, and I'd like to ask for your assistance in that. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Takakura-san. May we also request that before we move on to leadership of industrial global level, can I request everyone to switch on their cameras, because unfortunately we can only take a screenshot of everyone. It will be good to have a photograph. Thank you. Yeah, Kalyani, can you please take photographs, the screenshots, please?
1 minute. Please open.
I also wanted to say express our solidarity for all the Sri Lankan colleagues undergoing these very difficult times.
Yes. Is it done?
Yeah, Purva, done already. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. May I ask Kemal now for his comments, please, and then the GS can close the webinar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sister Apurva. Let me first congratulate our Sri Lankan sisters and brothers for their unity, for fighting together, for cooking together, for standing up together. I think this is something quite important, given the complexity of the situation in the country. Indeed, there are important the points that we need to fight together. And there was a very good the ground reflection through the presentation from our Sri Lankan comrades and also Comrade Ahilan. Indeed, now Sri Lanka wants to be taken into the trap of the policies of international finance institutions, just looking at the monetary instruments, taking interest high and giving some money, but stealing the future of the country. And indeed, we need set of policies along with monetary policies, fiscal policies, as was mentioned. We need to have a fair taxation, particularly over wealth, over income, and it requires to be combined with industrial policies, agricultural policies. From that point of view, particularly, we ask our comrades to tell us their the demands after the meeting tomorrow and afterwards. Then we will certainly back those demands vis-a-vis the government, and also to transmit to the whole world for making sure that there is an increased awareness and solidarity with our sisters and brothers in Sri Lanka. This is something that we will certainly continue to do so, as we already did for the 13-point resolution vis-a-vis the government. And indeed, there was an important the point made by Brother Ahilan about the intervention in value chains. And I can already tell you that Industrial Global Union already raised the issue with the global apparel brands in the garment value chain. And we will certainly increase the voice. And this is an important area that we will certainly continue to do our job. And then our textile garment, the leather divisions will continue to intensify its efforts in supporting our sisters and brothers out there. And for sure, democratic rights, the peaceful demonstration, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and Brother Anton mentioned an ILO complaint. Indeed, we are very much prepared to give you support in your complaint and to make the voice in the committees, in the plenaries of the ILO, to make sure that all the violations of the fundamental rights are handled, are supported, backed by your global union industrial. One more action, we can certainly continue to do so, to take action with the European Union together with our sister organization, Industrial European Trade Union. We can certainly raise the issue, European Union institutions, once again, to make sure that so in their trade, in their the relations with Sri Lanka, they need to take into consideration of all those important economic, social, and democratic rights. Then that should be an important leverage as far as our Sri Lankan comrades are concerned. And I can once again announce that so we will continue to be shoulder to shoulder with you, my dear sisters, brothers in Sri Lanka. And your fight is our fight. Indeed, you are fighting for your rights and interests, for your future in the country. But what you are doing is also for the rest of the working class around the world. So this is why you are not alone. And then we will continue to do our utmost efforts in our power to support you. And our struggle continues, my dear sisters, brothers, comrades. Over back to you, Sister Apurva.
Thank you, Kemal. May I call upon Atle, please, to give his final words and close the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Apurva, and thank you very much to our Sri Lankan affiliates for this disturbing update. I have to say it's disturbing, although Anton has provided us with information all along over the last years, but it's really disturbing to hear now what seems to be quite a coordinated attack from the government and the international financial institutions to get a grip on what is left of wealth in the country. Industrial will be very eager to see what you come up with tomorrow from the meeting and to follow up, as Kemal says, on the demands that you make, both on international institutions, but also on your government when it comes to agriculture policy, industrial policy, and the deal that is maybe or probably going to be made with the international financial institutions. It is also important, as Kemal says, to keep contacts with European institutions because of the trade preference system that they have. And we have done that before, and we will certainly be in a position to work with Industrial Trade Union, European Trade Union, towards the European Commission and the European institutions. But first of all, this is again an attack against the basic trade union rights, which are the rights to organize and the right to bargain collectively, both at company level, but also at national level. And these are demands that we will never, ever accept being diminished. So when we get the results from your meeting tomorrow, our regional secretaries will come back to us and try to put together a plan that we can do to help our affiliates in Sri Lanka. We really suffer with you, but of course the suffering is basically now in Sri Lanka. And we really see the devastation that this is having upon the economy. And anything we can do possibly will of course be done from Industrial Global Union side. So I wish you very much courage in your fight, and please keep us informed about every development, and especially be concrete on what you think that Industrial Global can contribute with, so that we can be practical in our solidarity and support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atle, and we will now close the seminar. Of course, solidarity to all our Sri Lankan comrades. Thank you very much, and thank you, Comrade Ahilan, for coming and giving us such a broad overview of the situation now. So thank you. Bye.